Okay, up to this point, we've been focused on consequentialist ethical theories: ethical egoism, utilitarianism, ethical libertarianism. These three consequentialist theories acknowledge there's always four things in play. Anytime we face an ethical dilemma, there's some kind of situation that we're contending with, and we're motivated to act on some impulse, and we take that action, and then as a result of us acting, there's some set of consequences that manifest. And for each of these three consequentialist ethical theories, the anticipated consequence of the actions that we're considering, the anticipated consequences are going to determine whether or not the action is morally prohibited, morally permissible, or maybe even morally obligatory. Now, this week we're going to look at our first non-consequentialist ethical theory called Kantianism, and we'll talk about where it gets its name in a later lecture. To approach Kantianism, it might be useful to think back on a couple of the questions I asked you to respond to in your thought primer. One of the questions had to do with a chicken. And I described for you not the biological reality of chickens, but the behavioral reality of chickens, right? I described for you the kinds of things that chickens seem to naturally do. These are behaviors that seem to rise right out of the chicken's nature. And we can identify these typical kinds of chicken behaviors and imagine what it's like to be a chicken. If I were a chicken, I would imagine that I would feel some very strong impulse to scratch at the ground, to eat worms and bugs. I would imagine I'd feel a pretty strong sense of relationship with the other chickens. And I would probably even acknowledge, to some degree, a social hierarchy among my group of chickens, right? That pecking order. I would imagine if I were a chicken, I would like to lay on, or sit on the eggs that I lay, because that's what chickens seem to do. They seem to like to sleep in nests. They seem to like to climb up into the rafters of the chicken coop. And all of these things are things that chickens don't have to be taught to do. These seem to be behaviors that seem to naturally, or seem to be natural expressions of the chicken's chickenness, right? These are the types of things that chickens just do. It's part of what makes them chickens. I also asked you about the Alaskan Husky Chuckles. And you know that Huskies have particular natures. There's a nature that Alaskan Huskies that an Alaskan Husky has that is distinct from the nature of a Labrador Retriever or a Border Collie or a Lap Dog. And while it is true that every individual dog has its own distinct personality and dogs do the kinds of things they've been trained to do, we also recognize there are certain kinds of things that seem to come naturally to some dog breeds, right? If I have an English Springer Spaniel, it's going to be hard getting that dog out of the water because it's just part of its nature to want to swim. If I have a Labrador Retriever, it's going to want so badly to retrieve things because that's part of its nature, okay? A Border Collie, it's constantly going to be hitting up against my leg with its hip, trying to herd me into some area because it's just what Border Collies do. It's a part of their nature. Now, what I asked you to consider with regard to chickens and chuckles is this. If we created an environment where the chickens and chuckles we're not able to express the behaviors that are a part of their natures, are we doing something wrong to them? Are we wronging them? If I confine the chicken to a really tiny cage and it can't do any of those behaviors that I described a moment ago, if I keep the Border Collie in a tiny little cage and never allow it to interact with anything, am I harming it? Am I wronging it? Am I doing something morally wrong to it? Now, one response to this question might be, well, look, as long as Chuckles is well fed and you take him on walks a couple times a day, then confining him to this very tiny apartment in hot Phoenix, Arizona is not necessarily wronging him. He doesn't even know any different. So how could you be wronging him? And I'd push back on that kind of a response just a little bit by saying this. If you don't know that somebody did something to you that prevented you from experiencing your full you-ness, would you not be wronged because you didn't know what they had prevented you from experiencing? Or would it be the case that you would feel that you were being wronged even if you didn't know that somebody had prevented you from experiencing your full nature, your full you-ness? Okay? And so think about this question here about nature. And the next question we need to ask ourselves is this. If it's the case that chickens and chuckles have a nature that we can identify that indicates to us what it's like to be these things, does the same hold for human beings? Do human beings have a nature that extends beyond just their physical bodies? Are there certain kinds of things that human beings are in sort of naturally compelled or inclined to do and not do.